The rain did not fall in the northern English hills. It descended as a physical weight, a grey shroud that tasted of iron and ancient soot. Inside the derelict toll house of the Ashinme estate, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the faint, bitter tang of a dying peat fire. Philippa Caldwell stood by the narrow window, her spine as straight as the drafting rulers her father had left behind, her fingers resting lightly on the cold stone of the sill. She did not pace. She did not fret. She simply listened to the rhythmic, wet thrum of the river swale as it gorged itself on the mountain runoff. To the local villagers, the roar was merely the sound of a storm. To Philippa, it was a syntax, a complex language of hydraulic pressure and structural fatigue that she had been taught to translate since she was old enough to hold a plumb line. Beneath the roar of the water, there was another sound, one that made the marrow in her bones ache with a familiar, technical dread. It was a rhythmic, hollow thwack, the sound of loose masonry being hammered against the bedrock by the sheer force of the current. Each strike was a subtraction from the bridge's life expectancy. The central pier of the Ashinme Bridge, built 40 years ago with stone that had been surreptitiously thinned to line the pockets of the contractor, was failing. Philippa knew the math of it. She had assessed the river's rise against the notched stone, a granite marker she had placed in the silt 3 years ago, when she first realized the estate's stewardship was being neglected. The notched stone was not a simple piece of granite. It was a kingdom of certainty in a world of social flux, the only honest record in a county governed by Silas Vane's creative accounting. 20 minutes ago, the water had crested the 4th notch. 10 minutes ago, the vibration in the tollhouse floor had changed from a low hum to a sharp staccato shudder. The bridge was no longer a structure. It was a ghost held together by habit and the grace of fading mortar. Philippa looked at the brass clock on the mantel, its ticking a secondary pulse against the storm. She calculated the sheer stress on the abutments, her mind moving through the equations with a cold, practiced fluidity. The arch would hold for perhaps another hour, provided no external weight disturbed its precarious equilibrium. But the road from the south was the only artery into the valley, and the darkness was now absolute. Martha Thorne moved in the shadows behind her, the elderly maid's footsteps muffled by the layers of rugs they had used to keep out the draft. Martha was a woman of few words, her loyalty to the Caldwell name, a remnant of a time when Philippa's father had been the most respected architect in the north. Now, they were merely the inhabitants of a ruin, tolerated by the estate's acting steward, Silas Vane, only because no one else would live so close to the treacherous river. Martha placed a hand on the back of a chair, her knuckles swollen with the damp. She looked at the girl. Though Philippa Caldwell was 24, she possessed a stillness that made her seem much older, and saw the shadow of the man who had built half the manor houses in the Shire. The river was not a body of water. It was a ledger of debt, and tonight the bridge was insolvent. Philippa picked up her hooded cloak, the heavy bombazine fabric stiff with the cold. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. She took the heavy iron key to the toll gate from its hook beside the door. It was a massive thing, rusted and stubborn, a symbol of a forgotten authority. Silas Vane had ordered the gates left open months ago, claiming that a toll house without a collector was a nuisance to the local gentry. He wanted the road clear for his own interests, regardless of the fact that the masonry was leaching lime like a bleeding wound. Philippa ignored the order. She had always ignored the orders of men who did not understand the integrity of stone. She stepped out into the night, the wind immediately clawing at her hood. The world was a chaotic swirl of black and silver, the rain stinging her eyes. She made her way toward the toll gate, her boots sinking into the saturated loam. The river was a white-capped beast now, the spray rising in ghostly plumes that coated the iron bars of the gate. She looked toward the bridge, a dark, low shape spanning the abyss. It looked solid enough to the eye, but she could feel the shuddering of the ground beneath her feet. The earth was beginning to liquefy at the base of the northern pier. It was a matter of minutes, not hours. Suddenly, a sound cut through the gale, a sharp, rhythmic drumming that was not the river. It was the frantic, uneven beat of a horse at full gallop. Philippa froze, her head tilting to catch the direction. The rider was coming from the south, descending the hill at a speed that was nothing short of suicidal given the visibility. They were less than a mile away, and they were riding straight for the center of the arch. She did not scream. She did not wave her arms in a futile gesture against the dark. She turned to the heavy iron mechanism of the toll gate. The mechanism was a testament to decades of salt and rain. It was a beast of friction and neglect. Philippa threw her weight against the lever, her muscles straining against the resistance of the rusted gears. The iron shrieked, a high, piercing sound that was lost in the wind. The gate began to swing, its heavy bars groaning as they moved across the road. It was slow, agonizingly slow. She could see the spark of hooves against the flint of the road now, a single rider emerging from the curtain of rain. He was moving with a reckless hubris, a noble who believed the world would always yield to his momentum. She redoubled her efforts, the iron biting into her palms. She did not think of the consequences of stopping a traveler of rank. She did not think of Silas Vane's inevitable fury. She thought only of the bridge's keystone, which she could hear cracking like a pistol shot in the dark. With a final, lung-bursting heave, the gate slammed shut, the heavy latch falling into place with a definitive metallic thud. The road was blocked, the barrier was absolute. The rider saw the gate far too late. The horse's head came up, its eyes rolling in the lamplight of the toll house as the man hauled back on the reins. It was a brutal, ugly stop, the animal's hindquarters skidding on the mud, sparks flying from its shoes as it fought for purchase. The stranger was nearly unseated, his cloak whipping around him like the wings of a predatory bird. He brought the stallion to a halt inches from the ironed bars, the beast's breath coming in great, ragged clouds of steam. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the horse's labored gasping. The rider sat perfectly still, a silhouette of towering cold fury. He was a large man, his presence filling the narrow space of the road, his face shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. He did not speak at first. He merely sat there, the tension radiating from him in waves that were more chilling than the storm. Philippa stood her ground on the other side of the gate, her hand still resting on the iron lever. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. "What in the name of God are you doing, girl?" The voice was a low, resonant baritone, vibrating with an authority that had never been questioned. It was the voice of a commander accustomed to the silence of subordinates, now cracked with the adrenaline of a near disaster. "You nearly broke my horse's neck. Move this barrier aside at once." "The road is closed, sir," Philippa Caldwell replied. Her voice was level, devoid of the frantic energy that usually accompanied a confrontation. It was the voice of a surveyor delivering a report. It was precise, analytical, and utterly immovable. "The bridge ahead is no longer safe for passage. It will not support the weight of a mount, let alone a man in such a hurry." The stranger let out a short, harsh laugh that held no mirth. He leaned forward in the saddle, and the light from the toll house window caught the side of his face. He was younger than his voice suggested, but his features were carved from the same hard, unforgiving material as the northern landscape. His eyes were a startling winter grey, fixed on her with a predatory intensity. "I have ridden from London in 3 days," he said, his words clipped and cold. "I have been told by the steward of this very estate that the road was maintained. I do not have time for the delusions of a toll-keeper's daughter. Unlatch the gate, or I shall have the law see you removed from this hovel by morning." Philippa Caldwell looked at him, her gaze traveling over the expensive cut of his sodden greatcoat, the fine leather of his boots, and the heavy, mud-caked signet ring on his gloved hand. She did not see a nobleman, she saw a variable. She saw a man whose arrogance was about to be corrected by the laws of physics. The steward, Mr. Silas Vane, is a man who understands the value of a shilling, but knows nothing of the value of an abutment, she said. "If you cross that bridge, you will not reach the other side. The river has scoured the foundation of the central pier. The shear stress has exceeded the capacity of the mortar. You are riding toward a collapse, not a destination." The stranger's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, toward the dark outline of the bridge. The rain seemed to intensify, the wind howling through the valley like a wounded thing. He looked back at her, his expression shifting from fury to a strange, sharp curiosity. "You speak of scour and shear stress as if you were a mason," he remarked, though his tone remained guarded. "Who taught you such things?" "My father built the piers you are so eager to destroy," Philippa said, her voice tightening with the only hint of emotion she allowed herself. a quiet, fierce pride. He taught me that stone does not lie even when men do. If you wish to gamble your life on Silas Vane's word, that is your prerogative. But you will not do it while I hold the key to this gate. She did not move. She did not offer courtesy. She stood before the rusted iron barrier as if she were part of the earth itself. The rusted toll gate was not a simple barrier of iron and rust. It was a verdict. A sudden and immovable interruption of a life that did not know it was already forfeit. The stranger stared at her for a long, silent minute, the water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked at her straight spine, the ink-stained fingers clutching the iron, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the crushing social blow that would surely put this common girl in her place. But the word died in his throat. A sound erupted from the darkness behind her, a deep, booming crack that felt as if the world itself were splitting open. It was followed by a roar of water, so immense it drowned out the wind. The ground beneath their feet heaved, a violent tremor that sent the horse into a fresh panic. Philippa did not turn around. She did not need to. She knew the sound of a structural failure as intimately as a mother knew the cry of her child. The central arch of the Ashinme bridge had just vanished into the gorge. The stranger's face went white. The arrogance drained away in an instant, replaced by a haunting, hollow realization. He looked at the empty space where the road had been, then back at the girl who had stopped him. He was breathing hard now, the spray of the river hitting his face. He realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade to the chest, that he had been seconds away from a cold, nameless death in the dark. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It was the silence of a debt that could never be repaid with coin. Philippa merely adjusted her hood, her face a mask of stoic, technical victory. It was, after all, a matter of action, not of emotion. By the harsh measure of passing seconds, she had saved him. Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashinme, sat in the mud-spattered saddle, staring at the toll-keeper's daughter with a gaze that had finally begun to see. He was the very master she had been warned never to cross, yet he owed his pulse to her stubborn, ink-stained hand. The void where the Ashinme bridge had stood was not merely a gap in the road. It was a sudden, violent erasure of history. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the guttural, satisfied roar of the river swale as it swallowed the last of the limestone debris. The dust of pulverized mortar rose in a ghostly cloud, illuminated by the flickering lamp in the tollhouse window, before being hammered back down by the relentless rain. Arthur Sterling, the realm's overlord, did not move. He sat atop his trembling stallion, his hands frozen on the leather reins, his knuckles a stark, bloodless white against the darkness. The horse's chest heaved, a rhythmic, wet sound of terror that matched the hammering pulse in Arthur's own throat. The animal's front hooves were less than a yard from the edge of the precipice, where the macadamized road simply ceased to exist. Below, the water was a churning, iron-colored monster, its voice a cacophony of grinding stones and ancient drowned secrets. The stranger looked into the chasm, but he did not see the water. He saw the spectral image of himself and his mount tumbling into that iron-cold surge, a death that would have been as sudden as it was invisible. He was a man who had commanded regiments, a leader having navigated the treacherous currents of the capital's glittering ballrooms and the high-stakes diplomacy of foreign courts with a cool, detached superiority. Yet here, in the shadow of his own ancestral lands, he had been reduced to a shivering variable in a girl's mathematical equation. The abyss was a sentence without a period, a finality that he had walked toward with the arrogant stride of someone who believed the earth was his to command. The rain lashed against his face, a cold reminder that nature possessed no respect for titles or ancient lineages. He felt the weight of his own mortality, a heavy, suffocating thing that no amount of gold or prestige could alleviate. Philippa Caldwell did not approach him with the frantic concern of a servant. She did not offer a cry of relief. She stood by the rusted iron mechanism of the toll gate, her hand still resting on the lever that had just purchased his life. The metal was cold and slick with grease, the gears having groaned under her strength to drop the barrier just in time. Her spine was a plumb line, a vertical testament to the discipline her father had instilled in her before the world had turned its back on his brilliance. She observed the stranger with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a wound. She noted the way his shoulders finally slumped, the way his head bowed as the adrenaline began its slow, nauseating retreat. To her, he was not a nobleman or a traveler of rank. He was a structure that had been reinforced just in time. She did not see a master, she saw a survivor. The silence was a weight pressing against the eardrums, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the rain against the toll gate's iron frame. It was Arthur who broke it first, though his voice was no longer the ringing baritone of a master. It was a rasp, thin and jagged as broken glass. You stopped me." He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty space where the central arch had been. The steward said the masonry had been pointed only last Michaelmas. He swore on his life the road was sound. He swore the foundations were as solid as the very hills of northern England. "The road is sound until the river says otherwise," Philippa replied. Her voice was level, carrying across the howl of the wind with a terrifying clarity. "The river swale does not care for the oaths of stewards, sir. It cares only for the weight of the water and the integrity of the stone. Silas Vane may have paid for pointing, but he did not pay for the scouring of the foundations. He painted the face of a dying man and called it health. He disguised the decay with a layer of fresh lime, but the heart of the bridge was already hollowed by the greed of a person failing to understand those meant to protect it." Arthur Sterling finally turned his head, his icy gaze searching her face in the gloom. The fury that had colored his features minutes ago had been replaced by a hollow, haunting suspicion. He looked at the girl, at her wet cloak, her straight posture, and the calm, analytical light in her eyes. He saw the toll gate, which he now realized was a weapon of salvation, not a barrier of insolence. The rusted toll gate was not a simple piece of estate hardware. It was the only thing standing between his house and an absolute, watery end. He looked at the mud-caked signet ring on his finger, a symbol of a power that had nearly led him to a grave in the silt of the swale. The grime on the gold was thick, obscuring the Ashinme crest, much like the lies of his steward had obscured the truth of his own ruin. The spray of the river hit his face, tasting of silt and ancient, deep earth minerals. He felt the cold in his marrow, the realization that he was a stranger in his own kingdom, saved by a woman he had intended to trample under his horse's hooves. "Dismount," he commanded, though it was a request to himself more than an order to her. His legs felt like lead as he swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the saturated earth with a wet, heavy thud. He led the horse away from the edge, his movements mechanical and slow. He did not ask permission. He walked toward the toll house, his tall frame cutting a path through the rain, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling followed the lead of someone who owed him nothing. Inside the toll house, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence of the storm. The air tasted of beeswax, old parchment, and the faint, comforting scent of lavender that Martha Thorne used to ward off the damp. A single tallow candle burned on the heavy oak table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows across the walls, which were lined with drafting tubes, technical sketches, and technical drawings of the estate's waterways. Philippa entered behind the stranger, her movements economical and quiet. She did not perform the elaborate curtsy expected of a woman in her position. She did not offer a humble apology for the state of the room. She simply unpinned her sodden cloak and hung it on the peg near the fire, revealing a simple dress of charcoal wool that was as severe and functional as the woman herself. Arthur Sterling stood in the center of the small room, his presence making the low-ceilinged space feel even smaller. He did not look at the room, his eyes skimming over the precision of the environment. This was not the hovel of a peasant. It was a shrine to structural integrity and meticulous stewardship. On the desk lay a ledger, open to a page filled with neat, cramped columns of figures, water levels, dates, and notations on the vibration of the earth as measured against the notched stone. Beside it sat a technical drawing of the Ashinme Bridge, the lines executed with a level of detail that surpassed anything Arthur had seen in the estate's official archives back at the manor. Martha Thorne moved forward with a dry towel and a tin mug of warm ale, her eyes fixed on the floor in a gesture of habitual deference that Philippa ignored. Arthur took the towel, but his attention was caught by the sketches. He stepped closer, the firelight catching the sharpness of his face. He pointed a long, aristocratic finger at a section of the drawing that was highlighted in red ink. "This," he said, his voice regaining some of its resonance as he studied the cross-section. "This is the central pier. You have marked it as hollow. Why?" "It was not designed to be hollow," Philippa said, moving to the table with a candle to provide better light. She did not stand at a distance. She stood beside him, her shoulder nearly brushing his as she pointed to the intricate shading. "The original specifications called for a core of solid granite, but when I audited the stones 2 years ago, I found they were using rubble fill and a mortar that was more sand than lime. The shear stress was never the problem. The problem was the theft. The bridge did not fall because the river was too strong. It fell because the stone was too weak to resist the water's grammar." The stranger's gaze sharpened, reflecting the orange glow of the candle. He looked at the girl, then back at the drawing. "Theft," he repeated, the word sounding like a curse in the quiet room. "How can one steal the heart of a bridge? A silent, private art of survival for those who work for Mr. Silas Vane," Philippa replied, her voice devoid of bitterness, sounding only of factual certainty. "To be a steward is to be a guardian, and to be a guardian who steals is to be a murderer." He took the lead from the roof of the old mill and the granite from the bridge's core to pay for his own interests in the southern counties. He thought the river would be slow. He thought the bridge would wait for a dry season to fail. He did not account for the grammar of the swale, nor did he account for the fact that some of us still know how to read the stones. Arthur Sterling felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. He had trusted Silas Vane. He had sat in the distant seat of power, reading reports of flourishing crops and well-maintained boundaries, while the very foundation of his home was being hollowed out like a rotted tooth. He looked at the ink-stained fingers of the girl as she traced the lines of the bridge's collapse. She had been watching it. She had been counting the days, the hours, the notches on a stone that he had not even known existed. Every inch the river rose was a recorded debt in her book. The notched stone was not a simple piece of granite. It was a contract between truth and the abyss. It was the only honest record in a county built on the lies of an incompetent steward. Arthur looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the daughter of the man who had been cast out of Ashinme a decade ago for daring to speak of structural flaws. "You are Caldwell's daughter," he said, and it was not a question. It was a realization that the ghost of the man he had dismissed had returned to save his life. "I am a surveyor of what is left," Philippa answered. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze unflinching, her posture as straight as the plumb line on her wall. "My father died believing that stone was the only thing a man could trust. I have spent my life proving him right. You were told the bridge was safe because Silas Vane wanted you to believe he had spent your gold on repairs. If you had died tonight, he'd an act of God. He would have called it an act of God. He would have pocketed the insurance on the bridge, and the estate would have continued to bleed until there was nothing left but dust." The Duke of Ashinme sat down in the wooden chair, the ale untouched on the table. He felt the weight of his own negligence. He had been the master of a kingdom of ghosts, ruling over a map that no longer reflected the reality of the ground beneath his feet. He looked at the girl, who had dropped the gate, who had risked his fury and his horse's hooves to save his pulse. She did not seek his favor. She did not ask for a reward or a word of thanks. She simply waited for him to understand the math of his own betrayal. Measured by the ticking of the clock, the night was long, but in the silence of the toll house, the ledger was beginning to balance. Arthur looked at the signet ring on his hand and realized it was a heavy, useless thing without the integrity of the land it represented. He looked at Philippa Caldwell, who stood with a straight spine against the shadows of the room. She was not a girl of the kitchen or the parlor. She was the architect of his survival, the only person who could help him rebuild the ruins of his responsibility. "You will show me," he said, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating with a new, grim purpose. "You will show me every stone that has been stolen. You will show me the notches on your stone and the figures in your book. I have been riding through a dream, Miss Caldwell. It is time I woke up to the bedrock of my own estate. I will not have my house built on the hollow stones of a thief." Philippa did not smile. She did not nod in triumph or allow a single spark of joy to touch her features. She simply reached for a fresh sheet of parchment and a quill, her fingers moving with the precision of a practiced clerk. She did not ask who he was. She did not need to know his title to know the depth of his debt. A matter of action, not of emotion, she thought as she dipped the pen into the ink. The stranger was no longer a variable. He was a student of the ruin, and she was the only one who held the key to the reconstruction. The rain continued to lash the roof, a rhythmic percussion against the thatch, but inside the toll house the air was still and heavy, with the gravity of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The ledger was open, and the audit of Ashinme had finally begun. The morning brought with it a silence that was far more unnerving than the roar of the flood. The river swale had receded slightly, leaving behind a jagged, muddy wound where the bridge had once stood, the limestone abutments looking like broken teeth against the grey sky. Inside the toll house, the air was cold, the peat fire having died down to a few glowing embers during the long hours of the night. Philippa Caldwell stood by the table, her hands steady, as she organized the sheets of parchment she and the stranger had worked over until the small hours of the dawn. Arthur Sterling had departed before the first light of the sun had even touched the peaks, disappearing into the mist with a quiet, grim promise of return. He had not given her his name, nor had she asked for it. To her, he was the variable that had survived, the student of the ruin who finally understood the arithmetic of decay. She did not feel relief. She did not feel triumph. She felt only the weight of the work that remained, the cold, hard labor of proving a lie. Martha Thorne moved softly in the background, her breathing heavy with the dampness of the morning. She was preparing a pot of weak tea, her movements mechanical and laden with a deep ancestral dread. The elderly maid had lived through enough of the estate's history to know that when a bridge falls, it is never just the stone that suffers. She kept casting glances at the door, her ears tuned to the sound of the road. To Martha Thorne, the silence outside was a precursor to a storm of a different kind, a social reckoning that usually ended in the crushing of the small. Philippa, however, did not share the maid's agitation. She adjusted the heavy iron key to the rusted toll gate, placing it precisely at the center of the mantel. The key was not a tool of commerce. It was a testament of duty, the physical manifestation of her refusal to let a man ride into his own grave. The sound of horses arrived with the suddenness of a gunshot. It was not the rhythmic, solitary beat of a traveler, but the synchronized heavy thrum of a detachment of riders. Philippa Caldwell did not startle. She did not run to the window to peer through the glass. She stood her ground, her spine a rigid vertical line that ignored the sudden frantic fluttering of Martha's apron. The door did not open. It was struck, the wood groaning under the force of a heavy boot. When the latch finally gave way, the cold air of the valley rushed in, smelling of wet earth and horses. Captain Gregory Vance stepped across the threshold, his tall frame blocking the light, his uniform of the estate guard meticulously brushed despite the mud of the road. Behind him stood 4 men, their faces hardened by the morning chill, their hands resting on the hilts of their sabers. "Philippa Caldwell," Captain Gregory Vance said, his voice a flat, unyielding drone. He did not look at the room. He did not acknowledge the drawings on the table. He looked only at the woman before him, his eyes devoid of anything but the execution of an order. "You are under arrest by the authority of the acting steward, Silas Vane. The charge is the interference with a passage of rank and the reckless endangerment of a noble personage by the illegal obstruction of the King's Highway. You are to be brought to the Ashinme estate at once to face judgment." Philippa did not protest. She did not offer an explanation of the bridge's collapse or the life she had saved. She knew the grammar of Silas Vane's power. He would not seek the truth of the disaster, but rather a scapegoat to hide the evidence of his own criminal neglect. To the steward, her action was not a rescue. It was an insolence that had exposed his failure. "I am the collector of this toll house, Captain Gregory Vance," she declared, her tone level and authoritative. "I am the daughter of the surveyor who designed this road. I did not obstruct a passage. I prevented a murder. The bridge fell seconds after the gate was closed. If you wish to arrest me for the laws of physics, then you are wasting your time and the horses of the Ashinme estate." Vance did not blink. He stepped forward, and from his belt, he produced a set of iron shackles. They were heavy, rusted things, the metal pitted by years of neglect in some cellar. He did not ask for her hands. He simply reached out and seized her wrists, with the grip of an enforcer who viewed humans as no different from the stone he guarded. The iron was bitingly cold against her skin, a sharp, metallic contrast to the warmth of the fire she had tended. The shackles were not a literal piece of hardware. They were a contract of bondage, a physical symbol of the estate's attempt to silence the one voice that knew the truth of its foundations. Philippa Caldwell did not struggle. She did not allow a single gasp of pain to escape her lips as the iron clicked shut. She simply looked the captain in the eyes, her gaze so analytical and cold that the man momentarily hesitated. Martha Thorne let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her mouth, but Philippa silenced her with a single sharp look. "Tend to the fire, Martha," she said, her tone as calm as if she were ordering the morning's cleaning. "The ledger is closed for the day. I shall return when the audit is complete." She allowed herself to be led out into the grey light, her head held high, her posture as straight as the notched stone still standing in the river swale. They did not give her a horse. They forced her to walk between the riders, her shackles rattling with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed against the valley walls. To the men of the guard, she was a prisoner. To herself, she was a variable moving toward the heart of the equation. The journey to the great house of the Grand Domain was a trek through a landscape of quiet, aristocratic decay. As they ascended the long, winding drive, Philippa observed the state of the fences and the drainage ditches with the practiced eye of a surveyor. She noted the crumbling mortar of the gatehouse and the way the ancient oaks were being strangled by unmanaged ivy. The estate was not a home. It was a ledger of deferred maintenance, a kingdom of ghosts ruled by the greed of a person failing to understand the stewardship of the land. When the central residence of the vast property finally came into view, it was a sprawling, grey monument of Tudor stone and Jacobean grandeur, its many windows staring out over the valley like the eyes of a blind titan. It was a place of immense beauty and immense rot, the very air around it, smelling of damp stone and dying privilege. They led her through the servants' entrance, a humiliating path meant to remind her of her station, but Philippa Caldwell walked the narrow corridors with the dignity of a queen. She was taken to the great hall, a cavernous space of dark oak and soaring rafters that had seen the passage of 4 centuries of Sterlings. The room was thick with the scent of beeswax, old wood, and the faint, cold smell of the morning mist that had managed to penetrate the stone walls. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais beneath the towering stained glass of the east window, sat a mahogany chair of state. Silas Vane stood to the left of the chair, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of practiced, oily concern. He was a man of small features and large ambitions, his eyes darting toward Philippa with a mixture of hatred and triumph. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, Miss Caldwell," Silas said, his voice echoing in the vast space. It was a high, thin sound, lacking the bedrock of true authority. To drop a toll gate in the path of a traveller of rank is a crime of the highest order. To then claim the bridge was unsafe, a bridge I personally saw pointed and reinforced, is a slander against the stewardship of the Sterling lands. You have sowed panic and obstructed the work of the household. You will find that we have little patience for the delusions of a disgraced architect's daughter." Philippa refused to glance at Silas. She looked toward the dais, where a figure sat in the shadows of the high-backed chair. The stranger was no longer dressed in the sodden wool of a midnight rider. He wore a coat of deep charcoal wool, the linen of his cravat as white and crisp as a fresh sheet of parchment. His winter-grey eyes were fixed on her, with a stillness that was more terrifying than the posturing of Silas Vane. He did not speak. He merely watched as Captain Gregory Vance pushed her forward, her shackles clinking against the polished marble floor. The sound was the only thing that moved in the heavy silence of the great hall. Silas Vane stepped forward, his chest swelling with the importance of his own accusation. "Your Grace, this is the woman who impeded your passage. She is the daughter of that Caldwell fellow we dismissed years ago for his incompetence. She has been living in the toll house like a squatter, spreading rumors of structural failure to undermine my authority. I recommend she be held in the county jail until a formal trial can be arranged. We cannot have the peasantry believing they can dictate the movements of the peerage." The man on the dais finally moved. He leaned forward into the light, and as he did, he rested his hand on the carved arm of the chair. The grime of the road was gone, the mud of the river swale washed away by the luxury of the estate's baths. On his finger sat a ring of solid, heavy gold. The ducal signet was not a literal piece of jewelry. It was a sovereign power, a finality of rank that could unmake a man with a single gesture. The Ashinme crest, a rising hawk above a bridge of 3 arches, shone in the morning light with a brilliance that seemed to burn the air. It was the mud-caked signet Philippa had seen the night before, now cleansed of its filth. The same heavy circle of gold that had been gripped white against the rains as the bridge vanished into the gorge. Philippa Caldwell felt a sharp, sudden jolt of recognition, but she did not flinch. She did not drop to her knees in a display of frantic, belated humility. She simply stood with her spine straight, her eyes meeting the winter-grey eyes of the man with a clarity that ignored the shackles on her wrists. She realized, with a cold and mathematical certainty, that the traveler she had treated as a student was the very master of the stone she surveyed. Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashinme, looked at her for a long, silent minute, his expression unreadable. "You saved my horse, Miss Caldwell," the Duke said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the hall like a tolling bell. It was not the voice of the traveler who had laughed at her in the rain. It was the voice of an awakened lord, having finally seen the bedrock of his own reality. Silas Vane froze, his face draining of color, his jaw dropping as he looked between Arthur Sterling and the prisoner. "Your Grace," Silas stammered, his voice cracking. "Surely you do not mean to say that this girl, I mean to say, Mr. Vane, that if not for this girl's interference, I would currently be at the bottom of the swale." Arthur Sterling continued, his eyes never leaving Philippa's. He stood up from the chair, his tall frame casting a long, imposing shadow over the Steward. "I rode over that road because you assured me it was sound. I entrusted the safety of my person and my house to your reports. Yet, when the river rose, it was not your reinforcements that held. It was the gate of a toll-keeper's daughter." The Duke descended the steps of the dais, his movements deliberate and heavy with a suppressed fury. He walked straight toward Philippa, stopping only inches from her. He looked down at the iron shackles on her wrists, his mouth thinning into a hard, dangerous line. "Remove these," he commanded, and the word was not a request, it was a verdict. Captain Gregory Vance moved with a frantic speed, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the key. When the iron finally fell away, hitting the marble with a heavy, hollow thud, the silence returned more profound than before. The young surveyor refrained from rubbing her wrists. She did not show the bruises the cold metal had left behind. She simply stood before Arthur Sterling, her hands falling to her sides, her posture as straight as a drafting ruler. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the architect of his survival, the only person in the room who held the truth in her hands. The great hall was not a room of state. It was a theater of reckoning, and the audit of the estate had only just begun. Arthur Sterling looked at her, his winter-grey eyes reflecting a new profound respect, and for the first time, the social hierarchy of the River Swale Valley was measured not by blood, but by the integrity of the stone. Silas Vane remained fixed in place. A man who had finally, I realized, the ledger of his deceptions, was being reviewed by a master of the craft. The silence in the vast manor was a heavy, crystalline thing, shattered only by the measured footsteps of Arthur Sterling as he led Philippa Caldwell away from the trembling Silas Vane. The Duke did not look back at the Steward, whose face had transitioned from the pale grey of ash to a sickly, mottled yellow. He led her toward the private wing of the estate, past portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to watch her ink-stained fingers with aristocratic suspicion. Philippa Caldwell did not falter. She did not lower her gaze as they passed the liveried servants who stood like frozen statues in the corridors. Her spine remained a plumb line, a vertical testament to her own internal architecture. The main gathering room had been a stage for a public exoneration. As they entered the private library, however, the air changed. The scent of beeswax and old wood was replaced by the sharp, acidic tang of fresh ink and the cold, dry smell of parchment that had been undisturbed for years. Arthur Sterling closed the heavy oak door. The click of the latch sounded like the strike of a hammer against a stone. He turned to her, his sharp, pale gaze searching her face with an intensity that lacked the predatory edge of the previous night. It was the gaze of a man who was looking for a foundation he could finally trust. He gestured to a massive mahogany desk. Upon it lay a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and their edges worn. These were not the polished, decorative books seen in the public library. These were the actual records of the Ashinme estate's maintenance over the last 5 years. The Duke's study was not a room of leisure. It was a vault of silent accusations. He walked to the window, looking out over the rain-blurred valley toward the jagged wound where the bridge had been. "I have played the fool for 3 years, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice dropping to a low, jagged baritone. He did not let her face her. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders broad and rigid. The peerage expects a duke to be interested in the politics of the capital. They do not expect an interest in the chemistry of mortar or the drainage of a tenant farm. Silas Vane believed me to be an absentee landlord. He thought I was a man too distracted by my own status to notice the slow, methodical cannibalization of my inheritance. I allowed him that delusion, so that he would become careless. I needed proof that would stand in a court of law, not merely the suspicions of an owner who had been away too long. The young surveyor refused to look up from the page. She did not ask for permission. She sat in the high-backed chair and pulled the first ledger toward her, the weight of the book familiar and grounding. She did not look at the Duke. She refrained from offering him the comfort of a shared confidence. She opened the book to the most recent entries for the River Swale infrastructure. The ledger was not a record of gold. It was a map of a dying house. As she scanned the columns of figures, her mind began to perform the rhythmic internal calculus that was her private art of survival. She saw the costs of granite and lead, the wages for masons and laborers, all recorded with a meticulous, superficial neatness. The ink was still dark, the lines drawn with a ruler, masking the profound decay beneath the numbers. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Silas Vane's sweeping, arrogant loops that prioritized elegance over accuracy. It was a ledger built to deceive a gentleman who had never been taught how to read the grammar of stone. To the untrained eye, the books were balanced. To Philippa Caldwell, they were a record of structural impossibilities. She traced a finger over the entry for the central pier's reinforcement. The quantity of lime recorded here would have been enough to rebuild the entire span twice over. Philippa noted, her words sounding like the scratch of a pen on paper. And yet, when I stood in the River Swale last month, the mortar was leaching like salt in a rainstorm. Silas Vane did not buy lime from the northern kilns. He bought sea sand and ash, pocketing the difference while recording the price of premium stone. He did not hire master masons. Instead, he hired day laborers who did not know how to key a stone into the bedrock. These books are not an audit of wealth, sir. They are a confession of murder. Every missing barrel of lime is another fracture in the masonry, another invitation for the river to scour the bridge into oblivion. Arthur Sterling turned from the window, his expression hardening. He walked to the desk and looked down at the woman who was dismantling his steward's life with a single, steady hand. "I suspected the theft of coin," he admitted, his voice vibrating with a suppressed fury. "I did not realize he was stealing in the safety of the very ground I walk upon." He looked at her ink-stained fingers, which were now pointing to a discrepancy in the stone-cutting fees. "Why did you stay, Miss Caldwell? After what was done to your father, why did you remain in that toll house to watch over an estate that had discarded you?" She provided no words of comfort. She did not allow the memory of her father's disgrace to soften the hard, analytical line of her jaw. "Stone does not have a politics," she said, her voice echoing in the gloom. "It does not care for the whims of dukes or the greed of stewards. It only cares for the truth of gravity and the grammar of the earth." To leave would have been to allow the lie to complete itself. "I stayed because someone had to count the notches. Someone had to be the witness when the reckoning finally arrived." She looked up then, her gaze meeting his with a clarity that ignored the vast social gulf between them. A matter of action, not of emotion. The bridge fell because it was built on a lie. If you wish to catch a killer, you must look where the lies have been turned into stone. The Duke watched her for a long minute. The ticking of the brass clock on the mantel was the only sound in the room. He saw the daughter of the man he had wronged, and he saw the architect of his own survival. He realized that the restoration of Ashinme would not begin with a new bridge or a fresh coat of paint. It would begin with the audit of the very foundations of his house. He reached into the drawer of the desk and pulled out a heavy iron lantern and a small, pointed hammer. "The library is a place for theories, Miss Caldwell," he said, his eyes flashing with a new dangerous purpose. "Let us go to the cellar. I want you to show me the bedrock of the empire Silas Vane has built on my ruin." They descended into the undercroft of the manor. It was a place where the air was thick with the scent of wet lime and the ancient, heavy smell of the earth itself. The cellar was a labyrinth of vaulted stone. The pillars were massive and damp to the touch. The sound of the river swale was a low, distant thrum here, vibrating through the very soles of their boots. Philippa Caldwell led the way. The lantern in her hand cast long, distorted shadows against the masonry. She did not hesitate in the darkness. She moved with the confidence of a woman who had mapped the house in her mind, her eyes searching for the telltale signs of structural fatigue. She stopped before a massive supporting pillar at the heart of the north wing. "This is the primary load-bearing structure for the public rooms above," she stated, her tone devoid of emotion. She raised the hammer and struck the surface of the granite block. The sound that returned was not the sharp, clear ring of solid stone. It was a dull, hollow thud, a rhythmic vibration that spoke of a secret void within. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, his face pale in the lantern light. He watched as Philippa used the point of the hammer to scrape away a thin layer of mortar at the seam of the block. The mortar did not resist. It crumbled into a fine grey dust that smelled of sea salt and rot. It was the smell of corners cut and duties abandoned, a sharp contrast to the honest scent of the river outside. Philippa Caldwell inserted the drafting ruler into the gap, and it slid in nearly to the hilt without meeting resistance. "The hollow stones," she whispered, the words hanging in the damp air like a sentence of death. "These are not granite blocks, sir. They are shells. They are thin facings of stone no thicker than a man's hand, filled with rubble and scrap." Silas Vane did not just steal the lead from the roofs or the granite from the bridge. He stole the very bones of this house. Arthur Sterling reached out and touched the pillar, his fingers trembling with the shock of the discovery. He could feel the cold, damp vibration of the house's weight pressing down on the fraudulent core. Every gust of wind against the manor's high walls, every footstep of the servants above, strained against this fragile lie. The foundation was not a support, it was a tomb. He looked at the woman, who stood with her lantern held high, her spine as straight as the ruler in her hand. She had seen the ruin before he had even known it existed. She had been the surveyor of his collapse. She was the silent architect of a truth he had been too arrogant to see. "He has been selling the high-quality stone to the developers in the south," the Duke said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He replaced the solid granite with the waste from the old quarries. He was betting that the weight of the manor would hold just long enough for him to vanish. He was not just a thief. He was an opportunist willing to let the roof fall on my head while I slept. He looked around the dark, damp cellar, seeing the shadow of a catastrophe that had been averted by the narrowest of margins. Philippa did not offer him words of comfort. She was a woman of the ledger and the plumb line. She knew that the audit of the Ashinme estate was only just beginning. "The house is currently insolvent, sir," she replied, her cadence level and devoid of emotion. "To be a steward is to be a guardian, and to be a guardian who fails is to be a ghost. Silas Vane has turned your heritage into a theatre of shadows. If you wish to save it, you must rebuild from the bedrock up. You must remove the hollow stones and replace them with the truth." The Duke of Ashinme looked at the resolute surveyor. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a debt that could not be measured in gold. He saw the ink-stained fingers that had held the gate, the straight spine that had faced the shackles, and the analytical mind that had seen through the facade of his estate. He was the master of the land, but she was the master of the stone. "I will not have my house built on lies," he declared, his voice ringing through the vaults with a sovereign authority. "And I will not have it restored by men who do not understand the integrity of the work." He took the lantern from her hand, their fingers brushing for a brief electric second. The cold of the cellar seemed to recede, replaced by a new, burning purpose. "You will lead the audit, Miss Caldwell," he said. "You will survey every stone, every pillar, and every ledger. You will be the architect of the restoration, and Silas Vane will be the first of the hollow stones we remove from this house." Counted by the slow rhythm of the pendulum, the night of the storm was over, but the work of the morning had only just begun. Philippa Caldwell did not curtsy. She did not thank him for the opportunity. She simply looked at the pillar and calculated the weight of the granite they would need to make it solid once more. Her quiet, solitary method of endurance was now the public art of a kingdom's rebirth. The ledger was open, and the first entry of the new Ashinme was a matter of integrity, not of rank. The estate would stand, not by the grace of blood, but by the precision of her count. The morning sun bled through the high arched windows of the great hall at the Grand Manor, casting long, pale shafts of light that illuminated the swirling dust motes. The air in the cavernous space was thick with the scent of old floor wax, damp wool, and the cold, metallic tang of the morning mist that still clung to the ancient stone walls. These walls had stood for 4 centuries, weathering wars and winters, yet they were now being hollowed out from within by a far more insidious enemy. Philippa Caldwell stood at the center of the hall, her feet planted firmly on the polished marble. Her boots, still caked with the mud of the riverbank, struck a stark contrast against the gleaming floor of the peerage. Her spine was a rigid plumb line that ignored the agonizing weight of the heavy leather satchel hanging from her shoulder. She avoided looking at the gathered household staff who lined the walls like silent velvet-clad ghosts. She measured their silence instead. She observed the rigid posture of the footmen, noting how they leaned ever so slightly away from the steward, their loyalty already recalculating as the pressure in the room shifted. This unspoken, solitary means of preserving herself was no longer confined to the freezing isolation of the toll house. It was a calculus she now applied to the very breath of the room. She did not look at Captain Gregory Vance, who stood by the heavy oak doors, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber with a renewed, uncertain stiffness. She looked only at the tray she had placed upon the massive mahogany table. It was a commanding piece of furniture that had seen the signatures of 4 centuries of Sterlings. Upon the dark, gleaming wood sat 3 jagged pieces of grey rubble, a small glass vial of clear liquid, and the cellar hammer. The tray of grey dust was not a collection of refuse. It was a ledger of calculated murder. Silas Vane stood to the left of the ducal chair. His chest heaved with a frantic, shallow rhythm that betrayed the crumbling foundation of his composure. His cravat was slightly askew, and a fine sheen of perspiration coated his upper lip, despite the bitter chill of the hall. He looked at the satchel, then at the girl, his eyes darting like trapped birds beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Your Grace," Silas Vane began, his voice high and vibrating with an oily desperation as he turned toward the seated man. "This is an absolute absurdity. To allow this disgraced surveyor's daughter to bring common filth into this house is a profound insult to your ancestors. She is a squatter. She has spent her life in a ruin, nursing the pathetic grudges of a father who was dismissed for his own technical failures." Silas wiped a trembling hand across his brow. "Whatever she claims to have found in the lower depths is nothing more than the natural settling of an ancient manor. The foundations of the historical estate are as solid as the crown itself. I have personally overseen every repair, every pointing, every single brick laid in the last 5 years. I have managed the maintenance ledgers with flawless dedication. She seeks only to sow discord to mask her own insolence on the road." Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashinme, sat in the chair of state. His tall frame was relaxed, but his winter-grey eyes remained fixed on the steward with a predatory stillness. He did not shout. He did not defend his steward. He merely gestured with one hand, a slow, sovereign movement that invited Philippa Caldwell to begin. The mud-caked signet on his finger had been meticulously cleaned. The gold hawk and the bridge now glowed with a hard, unforgiving brilliance in the morning light. It was the same ring that had been hidden by the grime of the road 48 hours ago. Now, it served as a symbol of an authority that had finally awakened to its own betrayal. The Duke understood the language of the soil and the slow, patient syntax of stone. He watched the girl in the center of the room, recognizing the immense, unyielding strength in her posture. She was a solitary pillar supporting the weight of a massive revelation, and she did not tremble beneath the load. The hall waited in breathless anticipation, the silence stretching taut across the cold marble tiles. Philippa Caldwell stepped forward. She did not curtsy. She did not wait for Silas Vane to finish his frantic tirade. She reached for the cellar hammer, gripping the cold iron handle with ink-stained fingers. A matter of action, not of emotion, she thought. Her voice was level, carrying across the hall with the clarity of a struck bell. Mr. Vane claims to have overseen the repairs. He claims the foundations are solid. But stone does not have a politics, and it does not recognize the status of a steward. She raised the cellar hammer and brought it down sharply against the largest chunk of rubble. There was no bright, ringing resonance of solid granite. Instead, a dull, dead thud echoed through the hall. It was the sickening sound of structural void. It recognizes only the chemistry of its composition. The repairs recorded in the maintenance ledgers call for a mixture of 3 parts river lime to 1 part sharp sand. This is the recipe for a structure that will resist the damp of the northern hills and the scouring of river swale for a century. She paused, her fingers moving over the grey rubble with a clinical precision. The rough edges of the false stone bit into the calluses of her palms. It was a tactile reminder of the fraud she was about to expose, a physical manifestation of the corruption that had nearly killed the Duke. She did not shout, she did not accuse, she simply observed. Philippa uncorked the vial of vinegar. The sharp, acidic tang of the liquid instantly cut through the heavy scent of beeswax and old dust. It was a harsh chemical reality, invading the stagnant air of aristocratic privilege. She tilted the vial over the mortar, ensuring every eye in the room was fixed on the impending reaction. The river lime from the northern kilns is pure. It reacts with an acid in a specific, violent effervescence, she explained, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with truth. It binds the stone together, creating a seal that repels the weather. Sea sand, however, is laden with salt and silicate that has been scoured by the tides. It is dead material. It does not bind. It merely occupies space until the damp causes it to liquefy and bleed away. She dropped a single bead of the liquid onto the sample. There was no reaction. The mortar did not fizz. It did not hiss. The slurry bubbled sickly for a fraction of a second, then went entirely dead. It was a pathetic, structurally bankrupt response. The sand separated from the liquid, revealing the undeniable lack of binding agents. It simply absorbed the vinegar and began to slump into a grey, muddy slurry. The texture of the collapse was entirely wrong for structural binding. It turned slick and granular, bleeding across the mahogany like a disease. The heavy scent of wet ash rose from the ruined material, smelling of rot, profound neglect, and the cold reality of a flooded gorge. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the corner. Every servant, every guard, and the Duke himself watched the physical collapse of Silas Vane's authority on the dark wood. Philippa looked up, her gaze meeting the gaze of the steward with a cold, mathematical certainty. "This is not lime, Mr. Vane. This is sea sand and ash. You did not buy materials from the kilns. You bought the waste from the glassworks in the south and recorded the price of premium granite. You did not reinforce the foundations. You filled the hollow stones with refuse and pocketed the difference. The bridge fell because its heart was made of ash, and this manor is currently standing on a lie that is dissolving with every hour of rain." Silas Vane recoiled as if he had been physically struck by the masonry. He took a staggering step backward, his polished boots scraping harshly against the marble floor. He looked at Arthur Sterling, then at the slurry on the table, his face a mask of crumbling arrogance. The pristine image he had cultivated for 5 years was disintegrating just as rapidly as the false mortar. "She is lying," he hissed, though the word lacked the bedrock of conviction. His voice cracked, betraying the terror gnawing at his chest. "She has tampered with the samples. She is a saboteur seeking to undermine my authority and steal my position. Vance, remove her immediately. Throw her in the cellar, where she belongs. She is a threat to the stability of this house, and she must be silenced before her lies poison the staff." Captain Gregory Vance did not move. He looked at Arthur Sterling, then at the tray of rubble. The guard was a stern man of duty, a man who followed the ledger of his orders. But he was also a man who had seen the bridge fall. He remembered the sound of the collapse perfectly. He remembered the deep, booming crack that had signaled the death of the stone above the raging waters, a sound that would haunt his nights for years to come. He knew that if the Duke had crossed that span a moment later, the entire duchy would have plunged into chaos. He looked at Philippa Caldwell, whose spine remained as straight as the pillars she surveyed. In her steady gaze, he saw the undeniable integrity that Silas Vane had never possessed. She had stood in the storm and measured the truth, while the steward slept in a warm bed bought with stolen lead. The captain did not speak, but he shifted his weight. His formidable presence moved from the defense of the steward to the defense of the truth. His hand tightened on his saber, ready to enforce the real law of the estate. Arthur Sterling stood up from his chair. He walked to the table, his movements slow and deliberate, paced to the relentless swing of the pendulum. He looked down at the slurry of ash and sea sand, then at the ledger Philippa had placed beside it. "The secret war is over, Silas," the Duke said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that filled the hall with a terrifying gravity. "You believed I was a man distracted by the glitter of the capital and the politics of the peerage. You thought my absence was a lack of interest, a void you could comfortably fill with your own greed. You were wrong. I have been tracking the shipments of stone from the northern quarries for 3 years. I have been quietly auditing the leadworks in the south. I knew the coin was missing, but I did not know where you had hidden the crime. I needed a witness who understood the grammar of the stone. I needed someone who could see the rot before the roof fell." Arthur Sterling turned to Philippa. For a brief second, the icy hue of his eyes softened with a profound, earned respect. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a thick stack of documents. These were not the creative accounting of Silas Vane, but the internal shipping manifests of the southern developers, meticulously gathered over months of silent observation. The bag of rubble was not merely a heap of debris. It was a physical proof of treason, the Duke continued, returning his cold stare to the steward. "I have the records of the granite. You sold to the canal projects in the Midlands, specifically the northern navigation projects overseen by independent contractors. I have the port records from Liverpool, signed by your own clerks, detailing the export of our finest timber. I have the manifests for the lead you stripped from the mill and the chapel roof. You sold it directly to the roofing syndicates of the southern capital under a false company name, leaving the tenants to suffer the damp and the rot. You were not just a thief, Silas. You were a man who was willing to let this house, and everyone in it, collapse to protect your own insolvency. You traded the legacy of Ashinme for the fleeting comfort of a balanced pocketbook, and you left the structure to bear the weight of your sins." Silas Vane's bluff finally shattered completely. He did not speak. He did not offer a final oily defense to save his crumbling facade. The mathematical certainty of the evidence left absolutely no room for negotiation. He turned and made a frantic, clumsy break for the side door that led to the servants' quarters. It was a desperate, uncalculated movement. It was the frantic flailing of a cornered official who had realized the ledger of his life was finally balanced and the fatal debt was due in full. He did not reach the brass handle. "Vance," Arthur Sterling said. The single word was a sharp, cold command that cut through the cavernous space like a falling blade. Captain Gregory Vance moved with the terrifying speed of a soldier and finally found the right order to follow. He intercepted Silas before the steward could even reach the shadows of the corridor. His heavy hand seized the man's velvet-clad shoulder and spun him violently back into the harsh morning light of the hall. Silas gasped, his polished veneer stripped away entirely. There was a sharp metallic click echoing against the stone walls. It was not the rusted rattle of the shackles Silas had used on Philippa, but the crisp, heavy snap of the Duke's own iron restraints. Silas Vane slumped into the powerful arms of the guard. His face was a pale, sweating ruin of his former self, devoid of all his previous aristocratic pretensions. He did not struggle against the iron. He simply stood there, a hollow shell of a man. His stewardship ended by the precision of a tollkeeper's daughter. The echo of Silas Vane's struggling footsteps was eventually swallowed by the heavy velvet hangings of the corridor, leaving the hall in a state of suspended crystalline silence. The vast room tasted of cold stone and the sharp, acidic tang of the vinegar Philippa Caldwell had used to expose the fraud. The morning light, now broader and more unforgiving, illuminated the tray of grey rubble and the slurry of sea sand that still sat upon the mahogany table, like a public indictment of the estate's neglect. Philippa did not move from her position at the center of the marble floor. She did not relax her shoulders, nor did she allow the tension in her neck to yield to the sudden vacuum of power. To her, The arrest of Silas Vane was merely the completion of a necessary subtraction. The variables of the room had been simplified, but the equation of the estate's survival remained unsolved. She watched the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, Mot-Sat, measuring the stillness of the air with the same clinical precision she had used to measure the rise of the river. The hall felt larger now, purged of the oily influence of a steward treating the estate as a private treasury, yet it also felt colder. A vast stone monument to a house that had been hollowed from within. Arthur Sterling remained standing near the table. He did not move to his chair of state, nor did he dismiss the remaining servants. He looked down at the slurry on the table, his slate-colored eyes reflecting a deep internal audit of his own negligence. He had been the master of the map, but he had lost the reality of the ground. Arthur Sterling turned to Philippa, and for the first time since they had met in the freezing rain at the rusted toll gate, the predatory stillness in his gaze was replaced by a profound, measured transparency. He observed her straight spine, her ink-stained fingers, and the soot-darkened hem of her simple charcoal dress. The Duke did not see a common girl or a watchman's daughter. He saw the only individual in the county who understood the integrity of the work. "The inventory of your father's office was taken 10 years ago, Miss Caldwell," Arthur Sterling said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried no hint of the previous night's adrenaline. It was the tone of an equal speaking to a peer in a theater of shared labor. "Silas Vane told me the instruments were sold to settle the debts. He told me the maps were lost to the damp, and the records were a jumble of delusions. I believed him because I was comfortable in the lie. I chose the ease of a balanced report over the difficulty of a cold inspection." Arthur Sterling walked toward her, his boots striking the marble with a heavy, rhythmic finality. "I have found the instruments. They were not sold. They were hidden in a locked chest in the back of the masonry sheds, covered in the same sea sand he used to rot my foundations." Philippa provided no word of comfort. She was a woman who defined herself through the truth of the ledger, and the truth of the culpability belonging to Arthur Sterling was a debt that no apology could reconcile. "Instruments can be cleaned," she replied, her cadence level and devoid of emotion. "The math does not change because the brass is tarnished. But a house that has been hollowed out requires more than a new set of rulers. It requires a steward who understands that every stone is a contract with the future." She looked at the mud-caked signet on his hand, the gold hawk finally clear of the grime. "You have removed the thief, but the void remains. The north wing is still resting on a lie, and the river is still counting the hours until the next storm." Arthur Sterling stopped a few feet from her. He reached into the leather satchel he had carried from his study and produced a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of pristine white linen. He unwrapped it with the care of a priest handling a sacred relic. It was a seal carved from heavy brass and topped with an ivory handle yellowed by age. It bore the crest of the Master of Works, a set of scales balanced upon a bridge. It was the physical manifestation of an office that had been vacant since Caldwell had been driven from the boundaries. The brass seal was not a weight of decorative metal. It was a contract of unyielding stewardship. "I cannot return the 10 years you spent in that ruin," Arthur Sterling said, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that ignored the vast social gulf between them. "I cannot erase the humiliation of the shackles or the cold of the isolated house. But I can offer you the authority to rebuild what was broken. I am commissioning you, Philippa Caldwell, as the architect of works for the entire estate. You will have the power to audit every ledger, to oversee every quarry, and to strike the cellar hammer against any stone you find to be hollow." The Duke held out the seal, his hand steady. "You will not work for me. You will work for the integrity of the land. We will rebuild the bridge, and we will rebuild the manor, and we will do it from the bedrock up." Philippa looked at the seal. She did not reach for it immediately. She did not think of the wealth it represented, or the social status that would now be hers. She thought of the notched stone in the river, the granite marker that had been her only ally in the dark. She thought of the hollow stones in the cellar and the way the house had shuddered beneath her feet. She did not weep for the justice she had finally earned. She did not boast of the man she had humbled. She stood, her spine as straight as a drafting ruler, and accepted the weight of the brass in her palm. The metal was cold, but it felt solid, an honest, heavy material that did not lie. "I accept the commission," she agreed, her words sounding like the scratch of a pen on a new sheet of parchment. "But you must understand the grammar of my work. I do not build for the comfort of dukes. I build for the resistance of the water. If I find that the heritage of your house is structurally insolvent, I will tell you, and you will be expected to pay the debt in stone and lime, not in velvet and words. I would expect nothing less from the woman who dropped the rusted iron gate to stop my horse." Arthur Sterling replied, a small, grim smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. The audit has only just begun. The very next morning, the hall tasted of chalk dust and uncompromising resolution. Philippa began her work in the north wing, accompanied by a bewildered crew of estate masons who had spent a decade taking orders from a thief. She did not raise her voice to them. She made no apologies for the disruption. She simply handed the foreman a fresh ledger and walked to the nearest load-bearing wall with the cellar hammer in her hand. The men stood in silence as she struck the masonry. The strike delivered a sharp, resonant clack. The sound was solid, a true reverberation of millstone grit and lime. She moved 2 paces down the corridor and struck again. Finding the same honest resistance, she moved to the corner, where the dampness had begun to map itself in dark veins across the plaster. She struck the stone once more. The sound was a dull, deadened thud, swallowed by the void within. It was the unmistakable hollow echo of fraudulent masonry, the true mark of the hollow stones Silas Vane had commissioned. Philippa marked the block with a sharp slash of white chalk. "Tear it out," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chilled air, and the 5 blocks beneath it. "You will find nothing but sea sand and ash behind the facing." The foreman hesitated, looking toward the heavy velvet curtains, half expecting Silas to emerge and countermand the order. But Silas Vane was gone, and Arthur Sterling was standing quietly in the shadows of the gallery, watching the methodical dismantling of his ruined legacy. The Duke did not interfere. He simply observed the straight spine of the woman, who was saving his house, block by hollow block. When the masons finally brought their iron bars to the chalk-marked stone, the facing crumbled with pathetic ease, spilling a grey cascade of fraudulent rubble onto the pristine marble floor. The dust from the crumbling facade smelled of dried salt and ancient neglect, a scent she committed to memory as a reminder of the cost of ignorance. The men gasped, but Philippa only dipped her pen into a portable inkwell and made a precise entry in her maintenance ledgers. "We will replace it with millstone grit," Philippa instructed, her tone devoid of triumph, purely focused on the mechanics of survival. "Cut from the upper quarry, where the grain is tightest, and the mortar will be true lime, slaked for no less than a month. I will not have this house resting on the arithmetic of a coward." Day by day, the methodical purging continued. Philippa moved from the foundation of the manor to the collapsed banks of the river. She measured the shear stress of the water against the gorge, calculating the precise angle required for the new cutwaters. She did not build for aesthetic approval. She built for the brutal realities of the northern winter. The new bridge would not be a delicate arch of decorative stone. It would be a fortress, spanning the aggressive tide. She worked until her fingers were stained permanently with ink and chalk, and the ledgers were thick with the documented truth of the estate's resurrection. It was a rhythmic, exhausting labor measured by the steady pulse of hammer against rock. 3 months later, the air in the valley tasted of fresh lime, cut granite, and the sharp, clean scent of the mountain wind. The grey shroud of the winter storm had been replaced by a crisp, golden autumn light that turned the river into a ribbon of shimmering silver. The sound of the water had changed. It was no longer the guttural, destructive roar of a beast gorge-bound. It was a rhythmic, musical percussion against the bedrock, a sound of movement and life. Standing on the banks of the river, the new bridge rose from the gorge like a promise kept. It was not a creature of creative accounting or thin stone. It was a massive 3-arched span of solid millstone grit, keyed into the granite of the cliffs with the precision of a jeweler's setting. Philippa stood at the center of the new arch, her boots planted firmly on the compacted stone road. She was dressed in a gown of deep blue wool, the fabric heavy and functional, her brass seal hanging from a silver chain at her waist. She was no longer the ghost of the isolated house. She was the master architect of the county's restoration. She looked down at the water, watching the way the current broke around the central pier. She had designed the cutwaters to be sharper, more streamlined, reducing the shear stress that had destroyed her father's work. The masonry was perfect, the mortar as white and hard as bone. She did not boast, she did not smile. She observed the current breaking against the solid stone, feeling the quiet, ordered peace of a balanced ledger. Arthur Sterling walked toward her from the southern bank. He had spent the morning in the village, overseeing the redistribution of the funds Silas Vane had embezzled, ensuring that the tenants whose roofs had leaked for a decade were the first to receive the new materials. He stopped beside her, his tall frame cutting a shadow against the fresh stone. He looked at the bridge, then at the woman who had built it. They stood together in a silence that was no longer heavy with suspicion, but light with the shared syntax of stewardship. "The villagers are calling it the Caldwell Bridge," Arthur Sterling remarked, looking out over the valley. The estate was changing. The drainage ditches were clear, the fences were repaired, and the hollow stones of the manor's foundation had been replaced with solid granite, one meticulously audited block at a time. The rot had been excised, and the new life was beginning to take root in the soil. "They say it is the only thing in the county that does not shudder when the wind blows." "The stone does not shudder because it is honest," Philippa replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is a matter of action, not of emotion. We gave the river a structure it could respect, and in return the river has given us the road." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the afternoon. "The ledger for the estate works is finally in balance. The debts of the last decade have been paid in full." Arthur Sterling looked at the woman who had saved his life, and then saved his legacy. He realized that the bridge was not merely a way to cross the water. It was a social contract, a connection between the master and the land that had been forged in the fire of her competence. He reached out and placed his hand on the stone railing, feeling the cool, solid strength of the work. He did not speak of love, for love was too vague a term for the profound, intellectual respect he felt for the woman beside him. He spoke instead of the future. "There is a mill in the Western Valley that needs a new weir," Arthur Sterling said, his voice quiet and steady, "and the chapel roof is still a matter of some concern. The audit of the estate works is a long labor, Miss Caldwell. I hope you have no intention of returning to the isolated house anytime soon." Philippa allowed herself the rarest of things, a faint, dignified smile that did not reach her lips but lived in the clarity of her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her maintenance ledgers, the pages white and waiting for the first entry of the new season. "The derelict station is a ruin," she concluded, her instruction firm with the authority of her office. "And I have always had a distaste for living in structures that cannot pass an inspection. The weir will be surveyed tomorrow, governed by the relentless march of time. We have much work to do." They turned and walked back toward the manor, two figures moving in unison against the backdrop of a restored kingdom. The rusted toll gate was gone, replaced by an open road and a foundation that would not yield. The story of the estate was no longer a tragedy of rot and betrayal. It was a testament to her quiet, solitary method of endurance and the sovereign power of the truth. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the new bridge stood as a monument to the woman who had seen the rot and chose to build a world where the stones no longer lied. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced.